So thank you all for coming and for appearing in such numbers. I see a couple of you even have copies of the book, which is fantastic, how to make me happy. So I'm going to talk to you a bit today about how to learn from diplomatic tradecraft and other lessons. And this is actually the title of chapter 8 of the book. And the kind of thesis is that diplomacy is something probably that we still need to discuss. How much do we need it? How useful is it in general for the purpose of international relations? But also, how much can we all learn from diplomacy, whether we're diplomats or not? And I argue that there are many skills that are quite useful to just about anybody. And there's another chapter, I don't know if we'll get to it today, called How to Drink Wine and Know Things. There's another chapter called How to Know People, which really is the essence of diplomacy. And I think these skills are quite useful for all kinds of people. So I'll just introduce my diplomatic career very briefly. Some younger people in the audience, in case you're thinking of asking me, how do you join the diplomatic service? I'm the wrong person to ask. I applied in 1979, January 1979. Margaret Thatcher was about to become Prime Minister. And I remember I got through the written exam. I got through the Civil Service Selection Board, which is a kind of assessment and development centre, as we say now. And then I was going to do the final selection board at Admiralty Arch in London. And to say I was nervous would be a massive understatement. I came down from Cambridge. I was in my third year, wearing a new suit, feeling very uncomfortable in this suit. I bought some new black shoes, which were also very uncomfortable. I walked in them all the way down to the station. When I got off at Liverpool Street, or King's Cross, wherever it was, my feet were so blistered I could hardly walk. And I stuffed bits of the Financial Times in the back of my shoes to try and counteract the blisters. Anyway, I arrived at Admiralty Arch for my interview. And before doing the so-called final selection board, which is the final part of the civil service process, I'd asked all my friends, what is the final selection board? There's no internet. And everybody said, if you get through the exams and the civil service selection board, you're as good as in. Just relax. Be yourself. Was this good advice? It really wasn't. I remember going into the room, so nervous I could hardly walk. I feel nervous even talking about it now. There was a grim-faced all-male panel there, and I sat down, and the first question was, imagine that Mrs. Thatcher has just been elected UK Prime Minister, and you are sent in to brief her on Britain's foreign policy priorities. What are you going to say? Which was a perfectly reasonable question if you're applying to join the Foreign Office, but one for which I was so unprepared and gave such an abysmal answer that I've completely forgotten what I said. But instead, I joined the Department of the Environment. This building here, you may recognize it. It's the old Marsham Street headquarters of the Department of the Environment. Working on freight transport, I joined the Property Services Agency and went to Berlin. This is the Potsdamer Platz. We might see a picture of it later, as it is now. That's the Berlin Wall. Those of you who are too young to remember the Berlin Wall never assume that it was just a wall. It was like a half mile of fortifications with these anti-personnel devices and so on. You can see the back side of the wall, several hundred meters behind. And then I joined the Treasury for the last couple of years. And then a friend of mine said, why don't you try again? And I said, well, I don't know if that's possible. And as it turned out, I did apply again. And they said, all you have to do is do the final selection board again. So I, by this stage I was more mature. I'd worn my suit more than once. My shoes fitted, and I studied everything. I read all kinds of books about the Foreign Office and what they needed and what they were looking for in new recruits. I bought a new tie from Liberty's, really well prepared, and I went in and grim-faced all-male panel, and the first question was. What do you think are the implications of the struggle for Welsh independence on the future constitutional settlement of the UK? And as luck would have it, I'd been out the night before to the pub with an ardent Welsh nationalist friend. So So I was able to blow this question out of the water, and probably in those few seconds I got my place in the Foreign Service. And so there's two lessons here. One of them, if I'm talking about lessons in diplomacy, one of them is don't judge a book by its cover. These jobs in the Home Civil Service were three of the most fascinating jobs I ever did. Very political, really intellectually demanding. I was dealing with supply-side policies in the Treasury. I was dealing with legislation in the Department of Transport. Actually, when I joined the Foreign Office, I had the world's most boring job answering letters from members of the public. And I thought, why on earth have I changed? So don't judge a book by its cover. And also, in regard to getting into the Foreign Office, a bit of serendipity can help. Sometimes you just get lucky, and you have to make your luck. So I'll run quickly through the various stations of my career. I went to Vienna for my first posting. Because I spoke German already, and that somebody resigned, met the Princess of Wales. This actually is me with a beard, very bad idea, in the British Ambassador's residence in Vienna, where I later lived as the ambassador for many years, looking very pleased with myself. And can you spot me in this picture? I'm photobombing the Princess of Wales. I'm the only Vienna choir boy with a beard, just going past here. And that went down pretty well. And then I went back to London. I worked on the European Community, as it then was, the European Community budget, and on counterterrorism. Then I got married to somebody who was also in the Foreign Office and who when I joined the Foreign Office, I got the bottom mark in the language aptitude test. And they said, you will never learn a hard language in the Foreign Office. And then I married somebody who had come top, and she'd already been taught Chinese by the Foreign Office. And she spoke also very good Russian. And we applied for a joint posting to Moscow. And we got the joint posting, so I learned Russian. And curiously, we'll come on to this later if we have time, I found I could learn Russian despite my ineptitude at grammar. And this is my Russian driving license. I like this picture because when we arrived in Moscow, the first thing we did as newly arrived diplomats was to go off to a special office. And the Russians had this massive wooden box camera that they used to take pictures of us. And they would then make 30 copies, and we got 10, and the organs of state security got the other 20. And one of them turned up on my driving license. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see they've retouched it a bit to make me look more Soviet, Can you see that? I mean, I look like a kind of Soviet killer robot in this picture. And this is the second coup of the three coups there have been since 1990 in Russia. The first one, of course, was in 1991 against Gorbachev, when it was still the Soviet Union. This is the second one against Yeltsin, which I lived through in Moscow. This is actually my picture of some armored personnel carriers going through the center of town. And I always point out to people that the reason Russia has invaded Ukraine is related directly to those two putsches, and indeed the putsch by Yevgeny Prigozhin that took place in 2023. Because Russia doesn't really yet know what kind of country it wants to be, whether it's going to be a democracy, as we thought it would be at this point. First two putsches were against that, or whether it's going to be an authoritarian state, which is the way it's very much going at the moment. So then I went to work on Hong Kong policy for the period 1995 to 98. This, of course, was the handover of Hong Kong to China. Really interesting job. This is obviously Beijing. This is the Ming tombs. Then I went to Bonn and to Berlin. I was Counselor EU and Economic in the British Embassy in Bonn and Berlin, dealing with things like mad cow disease. You remember that? My job was to persuade the Germans to accept British beef, amongst other things, which was quite tricky. But we did actually achieve this. I remember thinking it was a kind of pretty useless victory, because I could not imagine any German ever wanting to eat British beef for the next 10 years, because I don't know if there's any Germans here, fanatics about food safety. Little did I know that within almost weeks or months, Aberdeen Angus would be back on the menus of Germany. And indeed, when I arrived in Vienna as ambassador in 2016, there was actually a chain of restaurants called Rinderwahn, which, as you may know, means mad cow disease. And their slogan was crazy about burgers, So it all goes to show people have short memories. So I did 4 years of that, and then my then wife, unfortunately we're separated now, but she had been having 2 children, and she'd not been able to work full time. And so we agreed that we would swap jobs. So she applied for my job as Counselor EU and Economic in the embassy in Berlin, and I took 4 years to look after the children, or to be primary carer for the children, and also did quite a bit of journalism and wrote a novel. And this is a picture. This was still sufficiently unusual then. I mean, it's not completely usual now. That the FT did a little article about it, which they very unkindly titled "From Hair to Maternity." You know, the children were already at school, so it was, you know, the really heavy work was already done, but I did all the cooking and shopping and looked after the children and so on. I always say the best 4 years of my working life were the 4 years I took off work in Berlin, but really great experience. When I came back, of course, like 10 billion women before me, I found it very difficult to get a job in the Foreign Office. Nobody knew what I'd been doing for 4 years. I didn't have any appraisals. So I dropped down a grade, more or less, or stayed on my present grade, but became Director of Overseas Territories. Really interesting job. This is in Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands. This is Jonathan. He gets a section in the book. Jonathan, the world's oldest known land creature. He's just coming up to his 200th birthday. Amazing that he's lived all that time. He's in St. Helena, and he lives in the governor's garden. And in all those years, they think he was about 50 when he came from the Seychelles, and he's lived there ever since. And in all that time, nobody has ever forgotten to feed him. 150 years. Nobody has ever come and killed him, eaten him, thrown him over a cliff, set fire to him, you know, all the things that could have happened, because St. Helena obviously is a very stable place, and then this is in Bermuda. I then got my first job as an ambassador to Kiev back in 2008. Again, really because I happened to speak Russian and they needed somebody urgently. Very interesting place. Happy to answer questions about that later. Then I went as Consul General to Istanbul, which is the same level job. Also a very interesting place. We experienced the Gezi Park protests, which swept past the Consulate General in the middle of town when I was there and lasted for months and months. Often I give a talk called How to Deal with a Diplomatic Crisis, which looks at how it was being in the middle of all that. And then I was the Brexit ambassador in Vienna for my last 5 years, as ambassador to Austria and also permanent representative to the international organizations. Although I was dead against Brexit personally, I had to justify it to people and explain the British government's policy. You can imagine how easy that was. I mean, literally, our lines to take included on page 1 a line that said, "Brexit means Brexit." I mean, great. But the compensation, you can see me here, this is on the 31st of January 2020, looking rather somber, taking down the EU flag outside the embassy, which we did that night. But professionally, it was great because everybody wanted to talk to me about what the hell the British were doing and why. So I got to know a lot of people. And one perhaps result of that was that when I retired in 2021, an Austrian publisher asked me if I would write a book about lessons in diplomacy. In fact, they had a different title in the German version, which is The Hitchhiker's Guide to Diplomacy, which I thought was quite cool. And this is actually the frontispiece of the English version, this one here. And it's all how-to. So how to learn from diplomatic tradecraft. Let's have a little look at that. And we'll start off by looking at diplomatic immunity. Now, diplomatic immunity is one of those things that sounds fantastically old-fashioned. I mean, why on earth do we need diplomatic immunity? And I remember in 1984, the end of my first year in the Foreign Office, I was going out to lunch, and I came out of the Foreign Office, and I met a friend of mine. And he said, this was lunchtime, he said, "Something big's happened this morning. It'll be on the news. Something at the Libyan embassy." And what had happened was that there had been a protest against the Muammar Gaddafi's government outside the Libyan People's Bureau, which is what they called the embassy. And while they were doing this, somebody had leaned out of an upstairs window with an automatic weapon and sprayed the crowd below with bullets. and 13 people were injured, and one person was killed who happened to be this police officer, Yvonne Fletcher. And not surprisingly, the British government took a pretty dim view of this, and this was on the 17th of April. But the Libyans said, well, we've got diplomatic immunity. You can't come in. We're certainly not going to deliver up anybody. And anyway, it wasn't us who shot out of the window. It's all a frame-up. At the same time, a howling mob surrounded our embassy in Tripoli, in Libya, preventing them from leaving and accusing them of all sorts of crimes against the people of Libya. And bombs went off. There was one at Heathrow Airport. The temperature was really rising. This is actually a picture of police officers trying to resuscitate Yvonne Fletcher. And very tragic picture. And after 10 days, the British government, amazingly, really, and amazing that this is all forgotten now, let all the Libyan diplomats leave, because strictly under the letter of the law, they did have immunity, and they left with all their diplomatic baggage, which no doubt included the semi-automatic weapon, which could not be searched. This was all overseen by ambassadors of other Arab countries, and at the same time, the British diplomats in Tripoli were allowed to leave. And for me, this is a classic example of diplomatic immunity being a kind of necessary evil, because if you're in a country like Libya, or now Russia, or China, or North Korea, diplomats cannot operate in those countries without diplomatic immunity. At the same time, it's obviously wide open to abuse. And when British diplomats go overseas, they are told, you have no immunity unless there's a very good reason why you should, unless, of course, it's somewhere like Moscow. You have to pay your parking tickets. If you're arrested for shoplifting, you'll be in trouble. And of course, if you kill somebody with a semi-automatic weapon, you're going to be in court. And the British government will be only too happy to waive immunity for you. That's the conditions under which we go out. But at the same time, it's sometimes abused. And this other picture, anybody know who this is? Harry Dunn, yes. I mean, a classic example of the misuse of diplomatic immunity. He was killed by the wife or spouse of an accredited or an American with diplomatic immunity, and the US spirited her out of the country very quickly in order that she wouldn't face any kind of prosecution for the fact she was driving on the wrong side of the road and killed this guy who was on his motorcycle. So that's a little bit about diplomatic immunity. I'm just going to talk a little bit about cocktail parties. There's a section in the book called Fear of Cocktail Parties, and I do have a kind of fear of cocktail parties. This is actually a Queen's birthday party in Vienna. Many friends of mine in this picture. This is me. I just took this picture while I was giving a speech. How bad are they, or how good are they? Why would you want to go to a cocktail party? And if you want to irritate a British diplomat, just have to mention two words. Anybody know what they are? Ferrero Rocher, yes, whoever said that? Ferrero Rocher, yes, this kind of, it's a 1991 advert. Nobody ever forgets that. But they are at the heart of diplomatic business. So there's a kind of love-hate thing. Is it like a visit to the dentist? Quite often it is. You're thinking, how soon will this be over? Other times it can be quite fun. And the attendees, the people who come to these events, vary enormously. There's a lot who are what we call embassy groupies, who basically are fascinated by diplomatic life and want to go there and have a free drink. And then there's other people who are actually extremely useful, and it's like a sort of target-rich environment for the diplomat. And many of the people visiting these things, they always seek out the ambassador, and they want to tell you their pet project at enormous length and in enormous detail, usually standing about here. It can be really bad. I say in the book, many diplomats resort to alcohol to help them navigate such events. Some find it numbs the pain. For others, it intensifies the despair. Dry or alcohol-free receptions have the advantage that few people stay late or indeed come at all. Countries with renowned cuisine tend to attract good turnouts, although not always of the right people. And then not many ambassadors have heard the classic British advice on how to give a speech, which is stand up, speak up, and shut up. And you go to these events, you have an interminable receiving line, and then everybody goes quiet for what may be anything from 10 minutes if you're lucky to an hour if you're not lucky, while the ambassador stands up and says what a fantastic country he or she is from. And there may even be folkloric entertainment, you know, those words that strike terror into the hearts of diplomats. There are a few things which are good. I remember in Kiev in 2008, I was at an event at the Cuban embassy, in fact, and my phone went, and it was the Foreign Office, and they wanted me to lobby the Belgian ambassador on some aspect of policy towards Ukraine. And of course, being a cocktail party, both of us were there. So I went and spoke to him on this issue, the Belgian ambassador, and he beetled out of the room. And 20 minutes later, the Foreign Office phoned me up and said, "What the hell did you do? That was amazing. They've changed their policy." You know, so it is actually a place where you can do quite a bit of business. Now, I'll just go on to another one, which is diplomatic etiquette. Now, diplomatic etiquette, again, very old-fashioned. We're talking about tradecraft here. Do we really need it? And the story that I illustrate this with is when I was Director of Overseas Territories, and we had a very, very difficult relationship with Argentina, not surprisingly, over the Falkland Islands, or Islas Malvinas, as the Argentines call them. And but one of the things, and when I was Director of Overseas Territories, the Argentines refused to speak to us at all. They thought that by putting maximum pressure on the Falkland Islands, by cutting off flights, by not trading with them, by trying to stop other South American countries from allowing their ships to be repaired there and so on, they would put maximum pressure on the Falkland Islanders and they would concede defeat and say, okay, we'll be part of Argentina. I mean, obviously they've never met a Falkland Islander, who are the most stubborn, cussed bunch of people you can imagine, very, very passionately pro-British. But the Argentines would speak to us about fish, because fish, and in particular the loligo squid, this is a loligo squid, the loligo squid migrate between Argentine waters and Falkland Island waters with no passports or anything, and they reproduce at one end, and or they have sex at one end and reproduce at the other end, and so you need to manage both fisheries. And I actually went to Buenos Aires on one occasion to have discussions with the Argentines about squid. You know, you have to become real expert in some obscure subjects when you're a diplomat. And we had 2 days of talks. I remember on one occasion I was saying to Ambassador Eraldi, my opposite number, I said, look, this is a win-win situation. And he turned to me and said, Mr. Turner, I won't do the accent, he said, Mr. Turner, you say it is win-win, but I think what you are saying is, we win, you lose. Anyhow, at the end of 2 successful days of talks where we didn't honestly make much progress, they invited us all to lunch at the Argentine Foreign Ministry guest house. Anybody ever been to the Argentine Foreign Ministry guest house? Don't rule it out. Anyway, the Argentine Foreign Ministry, magnificent building, great restaurant for senior visitors, and I was the head of our delegation, so I was in the middle, and they served us a tremendous steak, you know, sort of off the sides of the plate on all sides, and then for pudding they served a fruit salad, and I tucked into this fruit salad, and as I was tucking into it, I realized that there was a big piece of broken glass in my fruit salad, and I thought, in a fraction of a moment, I thought, can they have done this on purpose? Is it just a coincidence that the head of the British delegation has a piece of broken glass in his fruit salad? Or is it some sort of disaffected member of the kitchen staff? Or what is it? Or maybe it's just by chance. And Ambassador Eraldi was sitting opposite me. And I thought, should I make a fuss about this? And I thought, well, if I do, they'll just think it's some sort of provocation that we've staged. You know, I've taken a piece of broken glass out of my pocket and put it in the fruit salad. So I decided not to say anything, and I just spat it out onto my spoon and dropped it from about 6 inches onto the plate, my side plate, so it went tinkle, 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 and all the Argentines sort of looked at it, and then we went on with our discussion. Why is this relevant to diplomatic etiquette? Because I had developed some kind of a relationship with Ambassador Eraldi. Although we had completely different agendas, nonetheless we respected each other and we trusted each other as far as it goes. And so I couldn't believe that Ambassador Eraldi would have known anything about this broken glass. And that was really like the respect of diplomatic etiquette, that you try to trust your interlocutor so far as you can, at least on practical matters such as pieces of broken glass in your fruit salad. Just a quick piece on when when diplomats dissemble, i.e. lie. There's a section about this in the book. When I was in the latter stages of my career, they invented social media. And I started off blogging, and then later on, all my blogs are still up on the Foreign Office website. Nearly half of all the blogs on the Foreign Office website. It's rather out of fashion now. And then along came the rest of social media, and I had a Twitter account. And one of the things that I used to do was to write these series. So, reasons to like Istanbul, hashtag reasons to like Istanbul. And I would post out pictures of things that I liked in Istanbul. And the Turks absolutely loved it. These things got enormous traction. I got huge numbers of followers. And I did the same when I was in Vienna. I asked my staff for a catchy slogan, and they came up with "Keen on Wien," which I thought was not bad. And that's a picture of the main staircase of the ambassador's residence in Vienna. And I mean, you will see immediately there's a problem here, because there's several problems. One of the problems is that ambassadors and diplomats, but particularly ambassadors, tend to suffer from a disease which is called postitis. And postitis is when you start to think that the country you're in is terribly good, and the government that you're accredited to isn't that bad really. And as I say in the book, the ambassador will write a telegram saying, despite the frequent beheadings in our country, there is excellent progress on human rights. That's one of the reasons why people are rotated so often after 3 or 4 years, so you don't go native, as it were. The thing is that in every country you will go to, there are fantastic things. And the question that you will be asked most often is, what was your favorite posting? So please don't ask that question later. What was your favorite posting? Because nobody in Moscow wants to hear that your favorite posting was Kiev. And nobody in Istanbul wants to hear that your favorite posting was in Vienna. And nobody in Vienna wants to hear your favorite posting was Berlin. So you always say, well, they're all great for different reasons. So you will never get a straight answer out of a diplomat if you ask them, what is your favorite posting? Indeed, this posting here, this is a lovely picture. This is when I left Istanbul, and all the staff came out and to say goodbye, and they threw water after me, which they say is designed to make you return soon. Very nice. That's what they told me anyway. Yeah, so if you want to catch a diplomat lying, just ask him or her what was their favorite posting. And of course, as I say in the book, what really distinguishes different countries is how desperate they are to be told they're the best country on earth. And which one won the prize, I am too diplomatic to say. Another thing that people talk about a lot in terms of tradecraft is surveillance. What's it like being followed around all the time? And I always remember when I was going to Russia for the first time in 1992 for my Russian language immersion. I was going for 7 weeks in Moscow with my rather pathetic Russian, and I was determined that I would not speak a word of English for 7 weeks. It's the only way I can learn languages. And we had our little group of language students from the Foreign Office who were going off to Moscow. This was only the second year they'd done it. They did it for the first time in 1991. Before that, they would send their Foreign Office Russian language students off to Paris to talk to old white Russians who still lived there. So they came away with really weird Russian. But the security risks were thought to be too high to send them to Moscow, with good reason, actually. They've stopped it again now for obvious reasons. But back in 1992, they thought that the risk was worthwhile. But nonetheless, the security service lady came to see us in London from MI5 before we went off to Moscow. And she gave us a lecture about sensible security precautions. But at one point she said, make sure that you're never in a room with only Russians. And I said, I was a bit older than some of the others, I said, look, we're going there to learn Russian. This is completely pointless. And she sort of sighed and said, well, try your best. Just be sensible. And when I was there in Moscow in 1992, there were a lot of stories about surveillance. I only spotted it myself a couple of times. Once when I went to play tennis with somebody, and we got our metro stations mixed up. Instead of Kropotkinskaya, it was something else. It was a Russian guy I was meeting. And so when I got to the metro station, I was standing there on the platform, and he didn't come, because of course he was at another metro station. And as I stood there for an hour waiting for him, my Russian tails were unable to remain hidden for all this time on an empty metro platform where people were coming and going. I spotted them, and interestingly, I then went back to where I lived in Tsvetnoy Boulevard. And just because I had a couple of hours spare, I thought, I'm not used to this area of town. I'll get off at a couple of stations and go and have a look around. And of course, these poor people tailing me must have thought I was taking the piss, because I got off the train, went up to the ground, walked around, went down again, and they had to follow me the whole time. And by the time I got back to Tsvetnoy Boulevard, they were so fed up, it was two men and a woman, that they actually blocked my passage when I tried to get off the platform, and I had to walk around them to get through. A little bit of intimidation there. Of course, things got better in theory. When we were in Moscow in the early 90s, the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, took over an office from Comecon, the former Eastern Bloc Trading Association. They refurbished it, 16 microphones in the ceiling of the main room. And this was a building that had been used by their allies, very extraordinary. And then eventually, I got to, almost the last time I went to Russia was in 2008, when I did another period of immersion in St. Petersburg. And I had this very nice Russian teacher, Svetlana, who was great. And she fixed up for me to go for some walks with a friend of hers who was an architect, rather suspiciously attractive architect, I thought, and very friendly, very open, all bad signs if you're worried about somebody trying to compromise you. Anyway, we went for some long walks, and I remember saying to this lady, I said, what do you think of Prime Minister Putin, as he then was? And she looked at me in the eye and she said, he is very short. And then I said, what do you think of President Medvedev, as he then was? And she looked me in the eye again, she said, he is even shorter. And then I thought this was very lovely, that Svetlana once was trying to teach me the Russian verbs of motion. Anybody speak Russian here? I'm sure a few of you do, yeah. So the Russian verbs of motion, famously difficult. And she started drawing this map of me leaving, li uyechal, here, pashol, vishol, all these different words for verbs of motion. And then she imagined FSB officers of the Russian intelligence, who were waiting at the metro station, who say, li priedut, or li prishol, li padashol. And at every point around my route, she said, here's a little remont obuvi, a little shoe repair shop. There'll be an FSB officer waiting there. And here's Svetlana saying, kakaya rados li priechel, how nice Li is here. Nakoniec observes the FSB officer who's been following me. So I thought that was a very interesting illustration, even in 2008, before Putin was really getting going in his oppression of the Russian people, that my language tutor just thought it was quite a good joke to suggest that these guys were watching everywhere. I did wonder afterwards, how did she know there was a shoe shop there? But anyway, that's another question. So look, we've got another 5 minutes. I'll just speak briefly about how to drink wine and know things. So how to learn languages. Personally, and I have a lot about this in the book, I think that one of the keys to happiness, including when you retire, is lifelong learning. Just keeping learning new stuff makes such a difference, not only to your quality of life, but also to your productivity when you're a bit younger, if you're engaged in productive activity. And I found that really completely focusing on learning languages at all times really helped my career. I would never have got my job in Vienna in the first place if I hadn't spoken German already. I was lucky enough to get up to C2 level in Russian when I went there in 1992. Again, I went back to Kiev as ambassador because they needed a Russian speaker urgently, or Ukrainian would have been even better. And the interesting thing is that I'm not very good at learning languages. There's a little story. When I started learning German at school, aged 15, we were still doing O-levels in those days. Anybody remember O-levels? It was a 2-year, thank you, it was a 2-year course, and on the way to taking our O-levels, we would do 3 exams. And so Christmas came along of the first year, and I took my German exam, and there was a grammar section. And the grammar section consisted of 10 sentences you had to translate from English into German. And for each sentence you translated without a mistake, you got 3 points, and then a point was taken off for each mistake in that sentence. So maximum 30 points. And in this first exam, in my German grammar, I got 0 out of 30. Okay, so not a good result. I then went on a German exchange to Germany, and my German became relatively fluent relatively quickly. And then my German was making steady progress, I thought, and along came the summer exam at the end of the first year. And in the grammar section this time, I again got 0 out of 30. So, not very striking progress. I then went on another German exchange. This was about 1973, I guess. And by this stage, my spoken German was quite good. And I really worked hard for the mock O-level and really did everything I could. And when the grammar section results came in, my German teacher, Mr. Matthews, approached me with a broad smile on his face and said, "Leigh, you've really done well in the grammar section," he said. "If you'd made a few less mistakes, you would have got a mark." Now, I mention this because also when I joined the Foreign Office, I took the Modern Language Aptitude Test, which is kind of in Kurdish and has all these things you have to listen to, like you listen to the numbers for 1 to 10 in Kurdish, then the numbers for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, then the numbers for 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and then you put the headphones on again and they read out a series of numbers starting with 7 and then maybe 14 and then 59 and then 672. And some people will do very well in this, and I did really badly. But when I went to learn Russian, which I had to because my partner already spoke Russian, and I was put on the Russian course despite my low language aptitude score, I discovered I could learn the language by immersion. And I used to go and watch movies every afternoon after we had 4 hours of language lessons every morning. In the afternoon we did our homework. I spent my time watching movies. I remember watching Comrade Stalin Goes to Africa. Anybody seen that? Great movie. Very, very typical of the Glasnost period. It was about Stalin doubles employed during the war. People say, there's lots of rumors there are Putin doubles out there as well. People often publish pictures saying, "Is this really Putin?" So Stalin doubles were recruited and then sent off to different places. And this chap is taken off the street and sent to a deserted mansion where he is trained up to be a Stalin lookalike. And I remember he gets out of bed on the first morning and says, "Где здесь туалет?" Okay, where is the toilet? And in that moment, I grasped a great swathe of Russian grammar. At the end of the movie, of course, Stalin dies and all the doubles are liquidated. So kind of pretty black comedy. But the reason I mention it all is that despite being a complete language duffer, I learned Russian to C2, I speak German to C2, I speak French, learned Turkish, which is a really difficult language. And so if anybody ever tells you, particularly if it's yourself, that you can't learn languages, don't believe it. It's all really about motivation, if you really want to do it. It's about self-belief. If you've learned a couple of languages, it's much easier to learn the next one because you always come to some obstacle where you think, I'm never going to master this. You know, verbs of motion I talked about, language aspects, any Turkish speakers here? Lots of things. And if you know you can do it, it's good. And thirdly, making a fool of yourself. Nobody ever became a great skier without falling over, right? Nobody ever became a great potter without some pretty terrible results. And the same with languages. So look, we've reached 40 minutes, so I'll stop there. I'll just quickly shift through all this. Lots of things. See it yourself. Fear of public speaking, very interesting question. Why do countries intervene in some things, not in other things? Is there a secret plan? These are the shape-shifting replicants. I can assure you this is not actually a picture of the inside of number 10. 3 tips on being a diplomat, being an ambassador. Social media, if you're interested in following me anywhere on any social media, I have a channel there. My blog, do have a look at that if you like, and the book is there. So thank you all very much for listening. I'd be delighted to answer some questions. Yeah, down here. Oh, yes, there's a microphone. And I forgot to tell you at the beginning, too late now, isn't it, that you're being recorded up here. But so if you're thinking of asking a really embarrassing question, don't ask it.
Who are we being recorded by?
Yes, so microphones are available, yes.
Leigh, my name is Nikki Santo, just come in from San Francisco, Queens College. Thank you for your comments. You said that the diplomatic skill set, tradecraft, is still necessary, and you said that its function is to understand people. Certainly you've talked about language as being one avenue for the understanding. But looking back on your career, what are some of your heuristics in understanding people and their intents and their biases, since those are all culturally embedded in high contexts that we don't access coming from our own backgrounds and contexts?
Yeah, I mean, culture is really important, and there's no silver bullet for any of this. I do think that old-fashioned diplomacy, which is getting in front of people face to face, is never going to go out of fashion. And the more you can do it, the more you will understand people. And the more broadly you can do it, the more you will understand them. And there is a thing, I say to young trainee diplomats, you should not only work very hard, which is kind of old-fashioned diplomacy also, but you should do everything you can to get contact with people of the country that you're being posted to, and you should find out everything you can about that country. And to give a couple of examples, I remember during COVID, we had, at the beginning of COVID in Austria, wasn't as bad, obviously, as being in some remote island where you weren't going to get home for 2 years, but Austria is still quite awkward with COVID. And one of the first things that happened was that the Austrians were accused of spreading COVID through the ski resort of Ischgl, if you remember this. But it was like a hard partying ski town full of young people. And they all came to Ischgl, they all went to massive rave-ups, they all got COVID, and then they went back across Europe. And the Austrians, I think a bit unreasonably, were criticized for not closing down Ischgl fast enough. So their response was to close down all of their ski resorts. And not only did they do that, but they insisted that all of the ski workers who were there, the saisonniers they were called, must stay there in case they were accused of sending all the Brits and the Italians and the Poles and all the other people who were the chalet people and the cooks and so on. They were accused of sending them to infect the rest of Europe. So, of course, after the first week, lots of British families started getting in touch saying, my son/daughter is stuck in a pension in Austria and they can't get home. What are you going to do about it? And every country had this problem because they just couldn't figure out how to do it. And we approached the Chancellery, we approached the Foreign Ministry, we approached the Health Minister. None of them could do anything. Of course, they were insanely busy with society collapsing around their ears. They had bigger things to worry about than a few hundred British citizens stuck in Lech and St. Anton. And then I remembered a young man called Andreas Weinseis, and this is my point, who I'd met when I'd been meeting the minister. We'd physically gone to see the minister. He'd had a group of people there. I'd hoovered up their cards. I'd chatted to them all a little bit, very important. And I remembered this guy, Andreas Weinseis, who was in the minister's office. And I said to him, I phoned him up. And he was, he never heard from an ambassador, so he was kind of pleased I'd phoned him up. And he said, yeah, it's all very difficult. We've got no time here. Sorry, we can't help you. But if you want to get your people out of these resorts, you've got to go to the provincial governors. They're the ones who can get them out. And to cut a long story short, I then got in touch with the regional governors. They were very nervous about the whole thing too, but after some intense negotiations of a day or two, including me signing a treaty with the province of Vorarlberg to promise that I would make sure that 2 people were properly treated when they crossed into the next province by car, we got all of our people out, and all the other ambassadors phoned me up and said, how did you do that? And the answer was because I knew this guy. So that's one part of it, is putting yourself out there. And the other thing which I think does make a difference is language. It's very old-fashioned, and of course we think that machine learning and instant translation, the Babel fish of Douglas Adams really is on its way. It almost exists already. But when, for example, I learned Turkish, I wasn't in a speaker slot, what we call a speaker slot, so my job didn't need me to know Turkish because most of the people I dealt with were English speaking. But I learned it anyway, and I found that the conversations I would have both with my staff, including my taciturn bodyguard, Ramazan, who was, spoke no known language, even Turkish. He came from the Turkish Black Sea coast and had an impenetrable accent. But you could have exchanges with people in their own language that you would never have had with them in English, because there would always be that filter, and they were always delighted you were speaking their language. Or in Urfa, where I went once, and just some guy on the street invited me in for a cup of tea, and I could talk to him in Turkish, made a hell of a difference. So I think really get out there, really try and soak up as much culture as you can, and don't be hubristic. Don't assume that somehow your country is better than all the other countries. Diplomats are always accused of this, going native, not being proud enough of their own countries. But if you're convinced your country is the best and everybody else are idiots, that's not a good start to a diplomatic career. Any other questions? Yeah, we've got 2 down here. I'll take one of them. Are you a couple? All right, you give us one question and then I'll give someone else a go. And just as people are leaving, I should say, if you want to leave, that's fine, but they only have 5 copies of the book outside, and I will be happy to sign them for you afterwards in the tent if you buy a copy later. Yes, sorry, question.
How do you speak diplomatically to a head of state who's completely unpredictable?
Well, I'm far too diplomatic to try and guess who you might be talking about. It's really difficult. I think that, in a way, diplomacy is a subset of society in this respect, in that the moods of the population are becoming increasingly volatile as the result of mass communication in the form of social media. I regularly meet Cambridge-educated people who say the most extraordinary things to me, and I think, how could you possibly think that? We've had Brexit, we've had Donald Trump elected twice, we've got different, perhaps not 100% welcome political groups rising in many countries of Western Europe, and all of this poses immense challenges. And we've seen, taking the example of Donald Trump, we've seen different leaders trying different approaches, and often it's to mind my language, but it's pretty oleaginous, to put it politely. And it gives you a rather uncomfortable feeling to see some of these leaders being so terribly nice to the President of the United States. On the other hand, I mean, it's a bit like, I'll say something controversial now, sending Peter Mandelson to Washington, with hindsight, massive mistake. Even without hindsight, very high risk, given his past record of having been fired from 2 jobs for inappropriate behavior. At the same time, you're dealing with somebody who's so how to put this politely, mercurial, that having somebody who's very high level with a known record of getting on with unusual people is maybe a risk worth taking. I mean, it obviously wasn't, it turns out. So really, really difficult, and it's not getting any easier. But if you look at other world leaders, let's say President Putin, how do you get on with him? That's also somebody who is very, very sensitive to his image, literally lets himself be photographed riding a horse bareback to show off his physique. I mean, these are all very difficult questions. And I think my main answer is just good diplomacy, good old-fashioned diplomacy. Try to do your best to get to know them, do your best to get to know the people around them, and do your best to build up some level of understanding, which is really difficult when people are attacking you. Yeah, over here.
If you had your time again, what, if anything, would you do differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I generally regard myself as being fantastically lucky that I snuck into the Foreign Office, and I had once you're in a career structure like that, applies to various organizations in the UK. You could talk about the armed forces or the police or universities even. If you keep your nose clean, you have a good chance of progressing upwards in a reasonable way. And I had a really lovely, fascinating career. Not always easy, but certainly fascinating. So I was very lucky. And there's not much I regret. There's a number of really stupid things I did, which I won't go into all of them here. But I mean, just on a rather superficial level, some of the things, I wish I'd been a bit more ambitious in terms of where I wanted to go. All my life, I wanted to go to South America and the Far East and places I didn't know. I was born and conceived and brought up in Africa. For example, when I was Director of Overseas Territories, I was the Commissioner of the British Antarctic Territory. And they kept telling me, come and do a visit. We'd love to host you in the British Antarctic Territory. This would have involved either sailing there from the Falklands via South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, fantastic, or else flying there from either the Falklands or from Chile. And I actually had my own flag as Commissioner of the British Antarctic Territory, which was in my desk with a penguin on it, or maybe even two penguins. And I could have flown it from my snowmobile, and I didn't do it. How stupid is that? Just because it would have taken me 3 weeks to get there and back, and I was incredibly busy, and I just thought, when am I going to fit this in? 2 young children and all this stuff. So that was one regret. And similarly, when I was much younger, before I joined the Foreign Office, actually, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, and at the time I didn't have a television, and the news came through that the Berlin Wall had fallen, and I kind of didn't pay it much attention. And then 2 or 3 days later, I was at somebody else's house, and I saw these amazing pictures of people on top of the Berlin Wall and cars coming through. And I thought, I should have gone, because German's my best language. I thought, I should have gone to witness this moment in history. And then I thought, well, it's probably too late now. 3 days have gone by. So I didn't go again. Twice, I made the same mistake twice. So yeah, I have a lot of regrets, but on the whole, no regrets. Somebody else over here, was it you? No? Or how about you at the back? Right at the back, gentleman there, in glasses, just by the camera. Yes.
Thank you very much, Leigh. I was going to ask you about the feedback back into governments. You're out there in the field in different countries. You get a good feel for what's happening. Do politicians really take your views back from there? Do you have a mechanism to feed that back? You talked about Brexit. Did they really understand the issues that you were facing when they made those decisions?
Yeah, the answer is, do people listen to what you're saying if you're an ambassador in the field? And it varies enormously is the answer. There's a bit in the book about a time when I was in Vienna and Chernobyl blew up, and radioactivity rained down over Europe, including notably in Austria. They emptied all the sand pits, they said children shouldn't go out of doors, this sort of thing. And we received a request from the Atomic Energy Research Agency, AERE, can't remember what it stands for, saying this was all a bit hush-hush. It wasn't classified, but it was don't tell your hosts. And they said, please take a square foot of grass that hasn't been harvested since the day of the explosion, push it in the diplomatic bag, and send it back to London. And I and my head of chancellery went in his Volvo to some suburb of Vienna, feeling a bit shifty. We felt like grave diggers, grave robbers. And we cut a bit of grass and we put it into the diplomatic bag. And we thought, of course, what on earth are they going to do with this information? What's going to be the results? And we sent it off. Never heard anything again. And as I say in the book, it often feels with diplomatic reporting as if you might as well put all your carefully crafted reports and analysis on a big bonfire in the garden and set fire to them for all the feedback you ever get. And in a way, this is one of the problems that diplomacy faces now, is total information overload. Since emails were invented even, let alone the internet, there is so much information coming into everybody. If you imagine back in the 80s, we would get letters by diplomatic bag from our posts in Central America on airmail paper, and we would read them with great interest to find out what was going on in El Salvador or Nicaragua. And these days, somebody sneezes in Nicaragua and you know about it, it's on social media. And trying to manage all this information, in my view, is a challenge that we have not yet mastered. And it's a real problem, and it's getting more and more of a problem. I came back from Istanbul to manage the Russian invasion of 2014 of Crimea, a time when I really thought World War III was about to start. And they created these crisis email distributions, which had on them everybody who might need to know about this crisis. So in some cases, hundreds of people. And then these people would reply to this, reply to all. And so hundreds or dozens of people were hitting reply to all on these huge copy lists. Not only did the actual infrastructure of the email system begin to break down, but nobody knew what the hell was going on. And when I arrived actually from Istanbul, I said, I'm not going to be on any of these copy lists. I assigned somebody to read everything and tell me if there was anything I needed to know, because I couldn't see any other way of cutting through the crap. And it's a real problem, and it's getting worse, and I don't know what the answer is. Yeah, how about you? Yeah. This may be the last question, so why don't I quickly take the three last questions, you and somebody at the back there, and just keep it short.
Sure, hopefully a quick one. I'm intrigued how you learned the social skills to be a high-level diplomat.
Right.
And the reason for asking is that I work in King Charles Street as an advisor, and I don't see my civil servant colleagues from month to month because most of them work at home.
Yep, next one, yep. Yes, it's you if you have a question.
Yes, so did you ever get an instruction from London and you looked at it and you thought, that is insane, these guys just do not know what's going on here. Okay. And what scope do you have for pushing back?
Yep, and finally, I'll just do it very quick. I've only got 1 minute left.
You made a reference to Mr. Mandelson's unexpected trip abroad. That reminded me of another surprise to us outside government. What did you think of Chris Patton's appointment to Hong Kong?
Yeah. Okay, so taking them backwards. I thought Chris Patton, excellent appointment, did a very good job in very difficult circumstances. No, not really. I mean, they wanted a political appointment. It's a bit of a surprise. Yeah, instructions to which you say no, you can go back, but depends on the circumstances. And when we were getting instructions on Brexit, for example, when we were instructed to do things that were illegal, people would say, we can't do that. And that was heard. But if you look at where we are in the US at the moment, it's really difficult. I mean, Trump is taking to court former head of the FBI. We're not there yet in the UK. I hope we never get there, but it's quite chilling. Social skills, yeah. I mean, there's an old-fashioned thing about when they used to recruit diplomats and they all went off to some house in the country and they were observed, about whether they had their finger sticking out in the right angle and all that. And I think the Foreign Office has got a lot more diverse in every sense since I joined it, which is generally good. But you're absolutely right about working from home being a huge problem we were hearing at the beginning, how do you really get up close to people and understand them? And you will never get the same understanding down a video conference or a telephone call as you will from being in the same room with them. And I continue to be a big fan of that. So look, sorry, I've gone slightly over the time, but thank you so much for listening. And if anybody wants a copy of the book, they're out there.